Thank you very much. And my apologies for not speaking in French. My French is not good enough to do this in French. But I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you about my favorite topic, namely, everything needs care. I need care. I would bet you need care. Our gadgets need care. Our built environment needs care. Nature needs care. So isn't it surprising that if everything needs care, that we have so little consideration for care in our economy? Economic progress continues to be measured primarily in final output of goods and services produced, measured in monetary amounts. GDP per capita. Now, we may all decry that this is a very limited measure of economic progress and that it lacks complexity, but isn't it strange that despite all manner of economic collapse, it still drives economic policy? So what I would like to do this afternoon is explore with you what might an economy look like that considers care. Because I would submit to you that in order to sustain current and future economic activity, we must not only attend to output generation, but also to the generation, the formation of care. And in fact, if we fail to do that, if we fail to consider care, then there may not be any future economic activity at all. So I want to explore that premise with you in three parts. Namely, first, why do we need care? What kind of care? And what might a care-conscious, a care-based economy look like? So let me start with the first one. Why do we need care? Well, we've made a little bit of progress, I would submit, since the start of environmental economics, as it was called 20, 30, 40 years ago now. And we have become quite aware of the fact that economic activity is not simply the transformation of inputs and output, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens. And of course, economists have termed that other stuff conveniently externalities, the generation of emissions, waste, and so forth. Certainly in some of our accounting systems, we've become a little bit more conscious of that. Green accounting systems, green technology, renewable resources are themes that have become quite common for us. And so there has been, in fact, some effort to internalize these externalities or to at least take them more into consideration. But the picture is a bit more complex than that. It's not simply about externalities because, as we all know, they're not really external. And so, a concept that I have found quite helpful is George Esco-Roegen's distinction between stocks that generate flows and funds that generate services. Now, what is this all about? These are, inputs being generated for the transformation and production process. Stocks, you might say, are those kinds of resources that generate time-independent flows. For example, you can burn 1 ton of coal for 7 days, or you can burn 7 tons of coal in 1 day. Doesn't make all that much difference, although we've learned from emissions and so forth, it might make a bit of difference. But you cannot do the same when it comes to some of the processes that are time-dependent and that have biological and physiological constraints. For example, you can ask a worker to dig 7 ditches, 1 a day. But you'd be hard-pressed to ask that person to dig all 7 ditches in 1 day. There is a time dependence to funds that generate services. So the funds remind us of the time dependence of economic activity and of the contextual nature of economic activity. Context, both spatial, environmental, but also social and cultural, because it makes a difference how much we can do, how we are constrained, biological, physiological, and time-wise. So that adds considerable complexity to the picture, both in the environmental, in the social sphere, and in the built environment. You might say, if care is neglected, things might be feasible, but they may not necessarily be viable. There are limits, physical, biological, time limits. So what kind of care might we consider to address these constraints? Well, there are 3 types at least. There are probably more, and you might help me think of more. But these are 3 that I've come up with: rest, restoration, and recreation. So let me start with rest. Rest is something that we don't deal with easily. In fact, we have sort of relegated rest to something that we like to not think about very much. We try and work harder, faster, increase productivity, cut down on sleep, cut down on off time. And so rest gets pushed out of the picture, almost like a negative thing to admit to. Well, I admit to that I need more of it as I get older. I don't know about you. Rest has been relegated much to the private sphere. And what's very interesting is that as the private sphere competes more with the market sphere, there's a real dilemma. You know, households used to be able to get along on one wage earner salary. And so other parts of the household were responsible for the rest, not just sleep, rest, but feeding and caring, nurturing, emotional rest, spiritual rest, not just physical rest. Now, I don't want to recreate sort of rigid assignments of responsibility between wage earning and caretaking activities that were usually somehow associated with gender. But neglecting them altogether really doesn't solve the problem now, does it? What about if we've really messed things up already royally and rest won't quite do it anymore? Well, I must admit then there may be a need for restoration, restorative care. We could think of healthcare as sort of the basic minimum of that restorative care in the social sphere. But that would certainly be a minimum requirement. And if we really want to talk about restoration, then it takes a lot more than that. Restoring physical health, restoring emotional health, restoring spiritual health, restoring social connections, restoring those things that motivate, that build up, that energize. Where do they happen in the social sphere? Well, they typically happen in communities, in social networks, in nature, in off time. But they also happen in the environment. In the natural environment, in fact, we have learned quite a bit about that kind of restorative care. And we need to continue to learn a lot more. We've learned about the fact that we can, to some extent, restore the absorptive capacity of the soil, the water filtration capacity of ecosystems. But you see, ecosystems are quite complex, and so are social systems. So it takes a lot to think through how do these restorative functions actually work, and can we replicate them? Or would we be better off to consider them in the first place in order to not diminish them? And if we ever needed some reminders of restorative care in our built environment, just look at infrastructure the world over. Collapsing highway bridges, crashes in technological system. Anybody have BlackBerry here? Crashes in water purification, water management systems. Infrastructure, built environments too need restoration and care. And yet another level is recreation. I think of recreation, the care of recreation, as that which goes beyond rest and restoration. It in fact creates creativity, builds capacity for your innovative juices to flow, to start to think out of the box because you've been able to power down, give your brain a rest as well as your body, have some quiet time, recreate. You see, the problem is with this neglect of restorative and recreative functions that somebody pays for them. And the neglect of recreative care is particularly problematic in a knowledge-based economy where we're dependent on ongoing creativity, on ongoing innovation. Now, certainly none of our societies would in any way want to own up to the fact that we might, in fact, adhere to something like the victim pays principle. But we might just do so due to neglect or ignorance or convenience. Now, what do I mean by the victim pays? The neglect of care means somebody pays, somebody is overburdened, overworked, has to walk further to the well, can't sleep, can't work, has a decline in productivity, gets aggressive. Sound familiar? It's called stressed systems. Now we can simply say the victim pays because, those who suffer the neglect of rest, restoration, and recreation, they pay, and their families do, their extended social networks do. So we might as well own up to two other principles. Maybe the community should pay for these functions to actually be in place and be considered in our economic activities. Or maybe we could say the polluter pays, the underminer of care pays. That would be a third principle. But we need to give some deliberate thought and attention to who pays, because somebody does, for sure. It doesn't just go away. So, what then are the principles of a care-based economy? What might they look like? And I must tell you, I don't have all the solutions. So I hope I can entice you to get your creative juices flowing to help me think about what this might look like. But I have found in my own work in regional economic development and community-based development that at the very least, we must recognize that economic activity is not just a bubble flowing around in space somewhere, but it is in fact undergirded by at least 5 pillars that must be intact in order for economic activity to be sustainable. And those 5 are health, education, social and cultural amenities, which includes civic engagement, environmental quality, and access to technology and transportation infrastructure. But a care-based economy would also have to meet the requirements of broad participation and diversity. It is the diverse perspectives of stakeholders that bring different knowledge systems to bear that helps us get a better picture of how we can get care properly accounted for, not just accounted for, but properly attended to. We need scientific and technical knowledge, but we also need social and cultural knowledge. And we also need the knowledge of those experts that are often non-credentialed, or experts, if you want to call them that have the symbolic context knowledge. It takes all of those perspectives in order for care to be properly accounted for and implemented. And third, it takes rethinking values and how we communicate these values. You know, I'm struck by the fact that we've known a lot and increasingly more about ecosystems, absorptive capacities, buffer capacities, and so forth. And yet, that technical knowledge, that scientific knowledge, doesn't seem to be terribly motivating to get people engaged in giving more consideration to care. So what else does it take? Does it take conversation about values? And if so, if values are equally as important as scientific and technical knowledge, then who is engaged in that debate? At least in the US, the debate has been hijacked by conservatives. It's a very conservative sort of family values-oriented debate. So how can we broaden that debate about values? I'm struck by the fact that one of the economists, sort of the father of economics, as many call him, namely Adam Smith, was very much engaged in talking about values. When Adam Smith observed the workings of the invisible hand that brought order to that potential chaos of individuals pursuing their own self-interest, Smith observed that that pursuit of self-interest works only within the constraints of a commitment to considering one's neighbor's needs. Compassion, a framework of compassion. So what's the ethical framework that we could debate and adhere to today that would entice us to not only think about care as a habit as much as we think about generating output, more stuff, but what ethical framework would compel us and motivate us to also act on that awareness for the need of care? Thank you.